The French Parliament has voted to make it illegal to pay for sex. People caught buying the services of a sex worker could be fined up to $1,700 for a first offence. Supporters of the new law say it will offer protection to sex workers and help tackle human trafficking. Many women, though, who work in the industry say it will drive their profession underground. Well, Tiana Bien-Aime, who is Executive Director of the international NGO Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, based in New York, joins us now via Skype. Her organisation advocates for the same type of law that's been introduced in France, and yet it seems that a lot of the French sex workers don't want it.
Well, thank you for having me on. And, you know, the question is, who are these self-identified sex workers? Not a term that we use. What the French government has done yesterday is follow in the footsteps of Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Canada to a certain extent, and a number of Northern Ireland, and a number of other jurisdictions that recognize the systems of prostitution as a system of violence and degradation and discrimination against women and girls.
And yet I've been speaking to a member of the Norwegian groups that represent prostitutes there, and they say their members are against it. They say it drives it underground. It makes men more reluctant to sort of show their appearance because they face a bigger risk of being caught out and fines, and it leads to more violence because the men obscure their identities.
There's absolutely no evidence of that, and prostitution itself is stigmatizing. Prostitution itself is violence. We are looking at a transaction where one individual has the power and the money. This transaction happens in private space, whether it's in the back of a car or at the Ritz Hotel. There is nothing that guarantees safety in prostitution. What the law does, what France is doing, is really looking at the systems of exploitation, the systems of trafficking. There is a link between the sex trade and trafficking. It's a simple economics issue of supply and demand. Every country that has legalized or decriminalized prostitution, Germany, the Netherlands, has seen an exponential increase in sex trafficking. Countries like Sweden, for instance, since the last 16 years, during which the law has been enacted, there has not been one murder of a prostituted woman by a John, a client, a punter, as the UK describes buyers of sexual acts. And in Germany, you have organizations counting women's bodies, women who are being murdered, mutilated, tortured by purchases of sex.
You see, other people would claim that the New Zealand model is perhaps the best one, which is the legalizing of all things to do with prostitution, just bringing it out into the open.
Prostitution is never brought out into the open. Prostitution is a system of oppression. The exchange of money is not consent to sexual harassment, to sexual violence, to denigration. The system in New Zealand is called decriminalization, which is a worse form of legalization because basically there are no regulations. So anything goes. The sex trade has an absolute green light to exploit women. The most marginalized women in New Zealand are in prostitution. The Maori, the Polynesians, the Pacific Islanders. If you look at brothels in Europe, up to 80%, 90% of women in brothels come from the poorest countries of Eastern Europe, from the global South, from Asia. You are looking at a multi-billion-dollar sex trade that preys on the most vulnerable individuals on the planet. And what the government of France has done is really couch this law in the framework of human rights, in the framework of dignity, which is a fundamental principle of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in the framework of democracy and equality. I think that's the self-identified sex workers very often either have an interest in the sex trade or are supporters of the sex trade, and they represent 2 or 3% maximum of the prostituted population. We inform our work on international law and more specifically on survivors of the sex trade who are informing us about the violence in the sex trade, the violence that they have suffered.
Okay. So I'm sorry to cut you short, but I'm afraid we are out of time. But Tiana Bien-Aime, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme.